"Maybe it's time you stopped pretending this was still your home," my daughter-in-law said while the funeral flowers were still fresh on the dining room table. I remember those words more clearly than I remember the weather that day. Some sentences settle into your bones and stay there. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 71 years old, and 3 weeks before that conversation, I buried my husband of 46 years. Richard had been the kind of man who never raised his voice, never forgot an anniversary, and never left a room without making sure I was smiling first. The silence he left behind felt larger than the house itself. Every morning, I still found myself reaching for a second coffee mug before remembering there was no one sitting across from me anymore. The house stood on a quiet street outside Columbus, Ohio. Richard and I had spent decades building a life there. We painted every room together. We planted every rose bush in the front yard. We watched our son Ethan grow from a little boy who chased fireflies in the backyard into a grown man with a family of his own. Or at least, that was the version of the story I used to believe. On the afternoon everything changed. Ethan and his wife Vanessa came over for what they called a family discussion. Vanessa arrived carrying a folder. Ethan arrived carrying guilt he couldn't quite hide. They sat across from me at the dining room table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals. The room still smelled faintly of lilies from the memorial service. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. Inside, neither of them asked how I was sleeping. Neither of them asked if I was eating enough. Neither of them asked whether I missed Richard. Vanessa opened the folder and smiled politely. "Margaret," she said, using my first name the way a stranger might, "we've been talking, and we think it's time to discuss your future." I folded my hands in my lap and listened. "This house is too much for one person," she continued. "The maintenance, the taxes, the utilities. You shouldn't have to handle all that alone." Ethan stared at the table. He said nothing. Vanessa slid several glossy brochures toward me. Retirement communities. Assisted living apartments. Places with cheerful photos of smiling seniors playing cards and walking through gardens. "You'd be happier somewhere like this," she said. Happier. I looked down at the brochures and then around the room Richard had loved. The grandfather clock. The framed family photographs. The piano he bought me on our 25th anniversary. Every corner held a memory. Every memory held him. "I'm not planning to leave," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile tightened. "Well," she replied, "that may not really be your decision forever." For a moment, the room became very still. Even the rain seemed to stop. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me. Waiting for him to remind her whose home this was. Instead, he lowered his eyes. And in that silence, I realized something far more painful than losing a house. I realized they had already decided what role I would play in the future they were planning. They thought I was a lonely widow with nowhere else to go. What they didn't know was that Richard had left behind more than memories. After Ethan and Vanessa left, I remained at the dining room table long after the daylight faded from the windows. The brochures sat where they had left them, spread across the polished wood like invitations to a future I had never asked for. I did not throw them away. I simply stacked them neatly and placed them in a drawer. Richard used to say that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they have already won. That night, his word stayed with me. The house felt unusually quiet. Not the peaceful quiet I had known during our years together, but a different kind of silence, one that seemed to listen back. I walked slowly through each room before going to bed. The living room still held the blanket Richard always folded over the arm of his favorite chair. His reading glasses remained on the side table beside a half-finished novel. In the garage, his toolbox stood exactly where he had left it. Everywhere I looked, I found evidence of a life built carefully over decades. Yet somehow Ethan and Vanessa spoke about selling it all as if they were discussing an old appliance nobody used anymore. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For 46 years, I had started my mornings with Richard. Now I sat alone in the kitchen, watching steam rise from a cup of coffee. Outside, a thin layer of frost covered the grass. Ohio winters always arrived earlier than expected. As I stared through the window, my phone rang. It was Ethan. For a brief moment, I hoped he was calling to apologize for the conversation the day before. Instead, he asked whether I had looked at the retirement community brochures. I listened quietly while he explained how practical the move would be. He talked about convenience. He talked about maintenance costs. He talked about planning ahead. He never once mentioned what I wanted. When the call ended, I sat there for several minutes holding the phone in my hand. The realization settled over me slowly. Ethan was not leading these conversations. He was following them. The words sounded like Vanessa's. The urgency sounded like Vanessa's. Even the concern felt borrowed. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. Several people stopped to offer condolences. Some had known Richard for decades. They shared stories I had never heard before. One neighbor told me about a family whose furnace stopped working during a snowstorm years ago. Richard had quietly paid for the repairs and never told anyone. Another man spoke about a scholarship fund that Richard had contributed to for years. I smiled and thanked them, but as I drove home, I found myself wondering how many things my husband had done without seeking recognition. Richard had always been private. Thoughtful. Careful. The kind of man who planned ahead for everything. That evening, while organizing paperwork in the study, I noticed something unusual. Tucked between tax documents and insurance records was an envelope addressed in Richard's handwriting. My name was written neatly across the front. Nothing else. No explanation. No date. Just Margaret. My heartbeat quickened slightly as I turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal had never been broken. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then I carried it to the desk where Richard had spent countless evenings working. Quietly under the glow of a brass lamp. Outside, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. Inside, the envelope rested in front of me like a question waiting to be answered. For several minutes I simply sat there looking at the envelope. Richard had always been deliberate with his words. If he had left something behind, there was a reason. The study felt smaller than usual that evening. The soft glow from the brass lamp cast long shadows across the shelves lined with photo albums and old books we had collected over the years. I ran my fingers across the envelope once before carefully opening it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The paper was thick and familiar. Richard had always preferred writing important things by hand. His handwriting was steady and unmistakable. Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain things myself. I need you to trust me one more time. I read the sentence twice. My throat tightened. It felt as though I could hear his voice speaking the words directly to me. The letter was not emotional. It was practical. That was exactly who Richard had always been. He explained that there were matters he had intentionally kept private. Not because he did not trust me, but because he wanted to protect me. Several paragraphs later, he instructed me to contact an attorney named Daniel Brooks if certain events occurred after his passing. What events? Richard did not immediately say. Instead, he listed a phone number and an office address in downtown Columbus. Then came the sentence that made me sit perfectly still. If anyone pressures you to leave your home, make decisions about your property, or rush you into changing your future, contact Daniel immediately. My eyes stopped on those words. I read them again. Then again. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The conversation with Ethan and Vanessa replayed in my mind. The brochures. The discussion about selling the house. The urgency. The pressure disguised as concern. Richard had anticipated something. Somehow, he had seen it coming. I continued reading. The remainder of the letter contained only a few more instructions. Simple. Direct. He asked me not to discuss the letter with anyone. Not even Ethan. Most importantly, he asked me to wait until I had spoken with Daniel before making any major decisions. When I finally finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting past the window. The neighborhood was quiet. Christmas decorations still hung on several houses even though the holidays had ended weeks ago. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt curiosity. The next morning, I called the number listed in the letter. A receptionist answered immediately and transferred me to Daniel Brooks. His voice was calm and professional. Before I could explain much, he asked a question that sent a chill through me. "Mrs. Collins, has anyone approached you about leaving your home?" I hesitated. "Yes," I answered. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Then I believe it is time for us to meet." We scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday. After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen staring out at the backyard. The bird feeder Richard had installed years earlier was crowded with cardinals and sparrows. Life moved forward whether we were ready or not. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. Vanessa was not with him. He seemed nervous. He paced around the living room while pretending to admire photographs he had seen hundreds of times before. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, Vanessa found a retirement community with a waiting list. If you are interested, we should probably move quickly." I looked at him carefully. He could not hold my gaze. "I am not making any decisions right now," I said. His expression tightened slightly. Not anger. Disappointment. As if I were delaying plans that had already been made. After he left, I returned to the study and looked at Richard's letter one more time. Whatever secret he had been protecting all these years, I was finally getting closer to the truth. Tuesday arrived grey and cold. The drive into downtown Columbus took a little over 30 minutes, though it felt longer. I had not been back to the financial district in years. Most of the buildings looked newer than I remembered. Glass towers reflected the winter sky while people hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Richard had always enjoyed coming downtown. He said it reminded him that the world kept moving no matter what happened in our personal lives. Daniel Brooks's office occupied the top floor of a quiet building overlooking the Scioto River. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room. The room was elegant but simple. A long wooden table stood in the center. Large windows offered a view of the city below. A few minutes later, Daniel entered carrying a leather portfolio. He looked to be in his late 50s. His expression was kind, but there was also something else in his eyes. Recognition. As though he had been expecting this meeting for a very long time. We exchanged greetings and sat down. For several moments, he reviewed documents without speaking. Finally, he folded his hands and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Collins, before we discuss anything else, I need to ask a few questions." I nodded. He asked about Ethan and Vanessa. Had they suggested selling the house? Yes. Had they discussed moving me elsewhere? Yes. Had they expressed unusual interest in Richard's finances after his passing? Again, yes. Daniel listened carefully to every answer. When I finished, he opened the portfolio and removed a thick folder. "Your husband was an extraordinarily thoughtful man," he said quietly. "He planned years ahead." I felt my heartbeat quicken. Daniel explained that he and Richard had worked together for more than a decade. During that time, Richard had reviewed and updated various legal arrangements. Some were ordinary estate documents. Others were not. Richard believed that character reveals itself under pressure, Daniel said. Especially when money becomes involved. I stared at him. The room suddenly felt warmer. "What exactly are you telling me?" I asked. Daniel slid a document across the table. The first page contained Richard's signature. The second contained pages of legal language I did not immediately understand. Daniel patiently explained each section. Certain assets had been intentionally structured in ways that were not publicly visible. Certain holdings had been kept separate from the information most people assumed represented Richard's entire estate. The more he spoke, the more confused I became. None of it matched the modest financial picture Richard had always presented. I thought about our life together. We lived comfortably, but never extravagantly. Richard drove the same pickup truck for nearly 12 years. He preferred repairing things rather than replacing them. He never flaunted wealth. Yet sitting in that conference room, I began realizing there had been parts of his financial life he rarely discussed. Daniel turned another page. Then another. Numbers appeared before me that seemed impossible. I blinked and looked again. Investment accounts. Business interests. Properties. Trusts. The total value exceeded anything I would have imagined. For several seconds, I could not speak. My husband had not simply prepared for the future. He had built something far larger than anyone around him suspected. Daniel allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "this is only the beginning. There is one more thing Richard wanted you to know, and I believe it may explain why he asked you to contact me personally." Daniel opened another section of the folder and carefully placed a document in front of me. Unlike the financial records, this one was shorter. Only a few pages long. Yet something about the way he handled it told me it mattered more than all the numbers combined. "Richard created this 6 years ago," he said. "He updated it twice after that, but the core instructions never changed." I looked down at the pages. The first paragraph contained language I did not fully understand, but one phrase immediately caught my attention. Conditional inheritance provisions. Daniel watched my reaction. "Your husband was not concerned about strangers," he explained. "He was concerned about the people closest to him." The words landed heavily between us. For years, Richard had noticed things I dismissed. Small moments. Offhand comments. Changes in behavior. At the time, I thought he was simply becoming more cautious with age. Now I wondered if he had been paying attention to warning signs I refused to see. Daniel continued. "Richard believed that any inheritance should be a blessing, not a motivation for selfish behavior. He wanted to make sure that the people he loved were being valued for who they were, not for what they owned." I remembered countless evenings when Richard sat quietly reading in the living room while Ethan and Vanessa visited. Looking back, I realized he often observed more than he spoke. He noticed who asked questions and why. He noticed who listened and who interrupted. He noticed things I overlooked because I always wanted to believe the best about everyone. Daniel turned to another page. "This provision becomes active if there is documented evidence that anyone attempts to pressure you into surrendering property, changing your residence against your wishes, or making financial decisions under emotional pressure following Richard's death." My stomach tightened. The retirement brochures flashed through my mind. The conversations. The urgency. The assumption that I would simply step aside. What happens if that provision becomes active? I asked quietly. Daniel folded his hands. "The inheritance structure changes." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he added, significantly. I stared at the papers. Richard had not acted out of suspicion. He had acted out of protection. The difference mattered. He had spent decades building safeguards not because he expected the worst, but because he wanted to ensure I would never be vulnerable if the worst happened. Daniel then showed me several records that had already been collected. Notes. Correspondence. Dates. Everything had been documented with extraordinary care. Richard had left instructions that certain interactions be reviewed if concerns arose after his passing. The more I learned, the more I understood how carefully he had planned. Nothing was impulsive. Nothing was accidental. Before our meeting ended, Daniel handed me a business card and a sealed envelope. "There is no need to rush," he said. "Go home. Take your time. Read what Richard left for you. Most importantly, do not allow anyone to pressure you into making decisions before you are ready. As I left the building, the winter air felt sharper than before. Traffic moved steadily along the streets below. People hurried through their ordinary afternoons, unaware that my entire understanding of the past few weeks had changed. During the drive home, I thought about Ethan. I thought about the little boy who once held my hand crossing parking lots and begged Richard to teach him how to ride a bicycle. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man I no longer fully recognized. And for the first time, I began wondering whether Richard had recognized the change long before I did. The days that followed felt strangely different. Nothing in my routine changed, yet everything seemed clearer. I still watered the plants in the kitchen window. I still checked the mailbox every afternoon. I still sat in Richard's chair room each evening with a cup of tea. But now I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. The phone calls from Ethan became more frequent. Vanessa's messages became more cheerful than usual. Their concerns suddenly felt rehearsed. 3 days after my meeting with Daniel, Vanessa invited herself over for lunch. She arrived carrying a bakery box and a smile that appeared the moment I opened the door. "I thought you could use some company," she said warmly. It was the same woman who had recently suggested I leave the home Richard and I had built together. I thanked her and invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table while she chatted about neighborhood news, home renovations, and vacation plans. For nearly 30 minutes she avoided the subject she clearly wanted to discuss. Eventually she leaned forward slightly. "Have you given any more thought to downsizing?" she asked. I stirred my tea slowly. "Not really." Her smile flickered. Only for a second. Then it returned. "I just worry about you being here alone." Alone. It was a word she used often now. As if loneliness automatically made someone incapable of making decisions. "I am managing just fine," I replied. She nodded politely, but disappointment passed across her face. A few minutes later she changed the subject again, though. Not before glancing around the kitchen as if mentally measuring the value of everything inside it. After she left, I stood at the front window and watched her drive away. Then I noticed something unusual. Ethan's vehicle was parked at the corner of the street. He had been waiting there the entire time. The realization settled heavily in my chest. They were coordinating. Planning. Watching. That evening I opened the sealed envelope Daniel had given me. Inside was another letter from Richard. This one was shorter than the first. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then certain concerns I carried may have proven justified. I hope I was wrong. More than anything, I hope I underestimated people." I stopped reading for a moment. Richard had always believed in giving people opportunities to prove themselves. But he also believed actions mattered more than promises. The letter continued. He described several conversations he had quietly documented over the years. Moments when financial matters seemed to interest Ethan and Vanessa more than family relationships. Incidents I barely remembered. Comments I had dismissed as harmless. Richard had not dismissed them. He had observed them. Recorded them. Considered what they might mean if circumstances changed after his death. By the time I finished reading, the winter sun had disappeared below the horizon. The house was dark except for the lamp beside my chair. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one. For the first time, I understood that Richard's preparations were never about money. The accounts, properties, and investments were only part of the story. The real purpose was protection. He wanted to know whether the people closest to us would choose loyalty when tested or choose something else. And more importantly, he had already created a way to find out. The following week brought an unexpected calm. Ethan stopped calling every day. Vanessa stopped sending cheerful messages. The silence should have felt peaceful, but it did not. It felt strategic. Like the quiet that settles over a room when people believe a decision has already been made. On Thursday afternoon, I received an invitation to dinner at Ethan and Vanessa's house. The message was unusually enthusiastic. Vanessa said they missed me. She said family needed to stay close during difficult times. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the gesture. Instead, I found myself remembering Richard's words. Pay attention to actions, not explanations. That evening I drove across town and arrived just before 6 o'clock. Their house sat in a newer development filled with large homes and perfectly trimmed lawns. Vanessa greeted me warmly at the door. Ethan hugged me and asked how I was doing. Everything appeared normal. Almost too normal. During dinner, they spoke about harmless subjects. Neighborhood projects. Television shows. Vacation ideas. Then, halfway through the meal, Vanessa casually mentioned a real estate agent she knew. The transition was so smooth that someone less attentive might not have noticed it. She specializes in helping seniors make life transitions, Vanessa said while arranging food on her plate. People absolutely love her. Ethan nodded immediately. You should at least have a conversation with her, Mom. I smiled politely and continued eating. Neither of them realized I was no longer hearing their words the way I once had. Every sentence seemed connected to the same goal. Every discussion eventually circled back to my future, my house, my decisions. Yet neither of them asked what I actually wanted. After dinner, Vanessa offered coffee. While she was in the kitchen, Ethan stepped onto the back patio to take a phone call. The sliding door remained slightly open. I had no intention of listening, but certain words drifted inside on the cold evening air. Not yet, Ethan said quietly. She is still holding out. I froze. A few seconds later he continued. I know. Vanessa said the same thing. We just need a little more time. The conversation ended before I could hear anything else. When Ethan returned, his smile looked forced. I pretended not to notice. The drive home felt longer than usual. Streetlights reflected across the windshield as I replayed his words in my mind. Holding out. More time. They were not discussing my well-being. They were discussing a plan. The next morning Daniel called. His voice sounded measured but purposeful. Mrs. Collins, I believe we should schedule another meeting. My stomach tightened slightly. Is something wrong? I asked. No, he replied. Actually, I believe certain pieces are beginning to fall into place exactly as Richard anticipated. We arranged to meet the following Monday. After the call ended, I walked through the house slowly. The morning sunlight filtered through the living room windows. Dust particles drifted lazily through the beams of light. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet I felt different. For weeks I had been reacting to events. Listening. Learning. Observing. Now, for the first time, I sensed that whatever Richard had prepared was approaching its final stage. And somewhere in the middle of all their careful planning, Ethan and Vanessa still believed they were the ones in control. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The city looked sharp and bright beneath the winter sun as I made my way back to Daniel's office. This time, however, I was not the only one invited. Daniel had requested that Ethan and Vanessa attend as well. According to the message they received, the meeting concerned final estate matters. When I entered the conference room, they were already there. Vanessa looked confident. Ethan appeared curious but relaxed. Neither of them seemed concerned. In fact, they looked like people expecting good news. Daniel greeted everyone politely and waited until we were seated before opening a thick binder. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heating system. Outside the large windows, traffic moved steadily through downtown Columbus. Inside, everything felt suspended. Daniel began by reviewing several routine estate documents. Financial statements. Property records. Administrative matters. Vanessa listened attentively. Occasionally she exchanged brief glances with Ethan. The confidence on her face never wavered. Then Daniel reached a section marked with colored tabs. His tone changed slightly. More formal. More deliberate. The next documents concern conditional inheritance provisions established by Richard Collins. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Ethan frowned slightly. Daniel continued reading. Richard had included specific instructions regarding the treatment of his surviving spouse following his death. Those instructions were detailed, precise, carefully documented. As the language became more specific, I noticed the first signs of discomfort crossing Ethan's face. Vanessa's smile slowly faded. Daniel described the conditions under which inheritance allocations could change. Attempts to pressure. Attempts to influence housing decisions. Attempts to create emotional distress for financial gain. Every sentence seemed to remove a little more color from Vanessa's expression. Then Daniel presented documentation. Dates. Notes. Records. Correspondence. Evidence collected exactly as Richard had instructed years earlier. No accusations. No dramatic speeches. Just facts. One after another. The room grew very still. Ethan shifted in his chair. Vanessa stared at the table. Finally, Daniel turned to the final page. Based on the activation of these provisions, he said calmly, the original inheritance structure has been modified according to Richard's instructions. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. Certain assets originally intended for future distribution would remain permanently under my control. Additional trusts would be redirected. Several anticipated benefits would no longer transfer as previously planned. The silence that followed felt enormous. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. Vanessa blinked repeatedly as if trying to process what she had just heard. For the first time since Richard's funeral, neither of them seemed to know what to say. I sat quietly, listening. Not because I felt victorious. Not because I enjoyed their discomfort. But because I finally understood what Richard had been trying to protect. It was never about punishing anyone. It was about revealing truth. Daniel closed the binder. The sound echoed softly across the conference table. Vanessa opened her mouth as though she wanted to object, but no words came out. Ethan stared at his hands. The future they had been planning suddenly looked very different from the one they expected. And as I looked around the room, I realized Richard's final lesson was unfolding exactly as he intended. When the meeting ended, nobody rushed to leave. Ethan remained seated, staring at the documents spread across the conference table. Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him. The confidence she had carried into the room was gone. In its place was silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence that comes when reality refuses to match expectations. Daniel gathered the papers carefully and excused himself, giving us a few moments alone. I looked at my son and saw something I had not seen in weeks. Not frustration. Not impatience. Regret. He finally lifted his eyes toward me. "Mom," he said quietly. The single word seemed heavier than anything else he could have said. I waited. For years, I had been the person who rushed to fill uncomfortable silences. That day, I let the silence remain. Ethan looked down again. "I did not know everything," he said. "I thought." His voice faded. He never finished the sentence. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. Some mistakes cannot be explained away with the right words. Vanessa remained silent. For the first time since Richard's passing, she seemed to understand that no amount of charm or persuasion could change what had already been revealed. I stood and gathered my coat. There was no anger inside me. Surprisingly, there was no triumph either. Only clarity. Richard had given me something far more valuable than financial security. He had given me the truth. During the drive home, I found myself thinking about our marriage. 46 years. Thousands of ordinary days. Grocery trips. Family dinners. Road trips. Quiet evenings on the porch. Looking back, I realized that Richard's greatest gift was not the wealth he had accumulated. It was the care he had taken to protect the people he loved. He understood that character is easiest to praise when life is comfortable. The real test comes when difficult choices appear. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the winter sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across the front yard and reflected softly against the windows of the house. My house. The home Richard and I had built together. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood, books, and coffee greeted me immediately. For the first time since the funeral, the house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. In the weeks that followed, Ethan called several times. The conversations were different now. Slower. More honest. There were no discussions about real estate agents. No retirement brochures. No pressure. Just a son trying to find his way back toward the person he should never have forgotten. Healing did not happen overnight. Trust rarely returns as quickly as it disappears. But at least the truth was no longer hiding beneath polite conversations and careful smiles. One evening, several months later, I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. A gentle breeze moved through the yard Richard had loved so much. Birds settled into the branches above me as daylight slowly faded. I thought about how easily people judge what they cannot see. They see a widow living quietly in an old house and assume they understand her story. They see age and mistake it for weakness. They see kindness and mistake it for helplessness. Richard knew better. And in the end, so did I. I picked up my cup of tea and looked across the yard. Somewhere beyond the fading light, life continued moving forward. Not exactly as I once imagined it would. But forward nonetheless. And for the first time in a very long while, I smiled, knowing that the future ahead of me belonged to nobody else but me.